This is the Editor's Half Hour. Step into the life of an editor for 30 minutes as we discuss the craft of editing, industry trends, and editorial resources. Your host is co-founder and CEO of Peak Publishing Inc., Nadia Jaja Pupa. She is experienced in all facets of the publishing industry, from editing to design, and works with corporate clients and self-published authors. Nadia and her guests are about to share powerful insights and stories on what it takes to be an editor. And this is your host, Nadia Jaja Pupa.
Welcome, listeners, to the Editor's Half Hour. We have a great episode. I am so excited to introduce you to Andrew Hodges. He is a fabulous editor. In fact, we met several years ago, well, maybe 2 years ago, I want to say, maybe 3, I don't know, but we were both on a panel.
Several years ago. Yeah.
It feels like several years ago. And we were on a panel presentation on switching between editing fiction and nonfiction. And it was such a fun presentation, and I had such good memories of it. It was through the Professional Editors Network, and I think we're both members of that group. So welcome, Andrew. We are talking today about developmental editing for world building. So this is going to be one of those just really interesting topics to discuss. So I'm so happy to have you, and I want to thank you for joining us. So please introduce yourself to our listeners.
Hello there. So my name's Andy Hodges, and I'm a fiction editor and book coach who lives near Edinburgh in Scotland. And I mostly do speculative fiction and LGBTQ fiction. And I still do a little bit of cultural anthropology because that was my background. And developmental editing is my bag. That's my main thing. But I do enjoy like a meaty line edit or copy edit sometimes as well. So that's me.
That's awesome. And why don't you tell your listeners about, or our listeners about, your podcast?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So I have my own podcast. It's very much a DIY outfit at this moment, but I'm having a lot of fun doing it. It's called The Free Space Lancer, The Freelancer. And it's all about tackling topics in the editing world from a queer kind of social justice perspective. So I'm digging into things like pricing and niching and all of these kind of business topics, but with a slightly different angle. So
I love that.
A fresh angle.
No, it is a fresh angle. I've already listened to at least 1 or 2 that you've posted. So I want to encourage listeners to head over to Andy's podcast. And so I'll put a link to that in the show notes for sure. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start at the very beginning of anthropology. That's your background, right? So your anthropology background. Let's just start there and share with our listeners how it evolved into the publishing world and editing.
Okay, so I worked as a cultural anthropologist for just over 10 years. First, I did a PhD at the University of Manchester. I was doing research in Serbia and Croatia. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And then after that, I built up a career for myself as an anthropologist. So I wrote academic books and journal articles and published on a bunch of topics. So for those of you who've never heard of anthropology, which is totally legitimate, not everybody has, cultural anthropology is about the experiences of living groups of humans. And it uses a method called ethnography, where you go and live with a group of people for a certain amount of time, like usually about a year, sometimes longer or shorter. And you keep a diary while you're there. So it's a little bit like memoir in some ways. You keep a diary of all your experiences, and you write about things that were important to that group of people. And then you turn it into like a big academic monograph, the word is, like a big book about all of those different aspects of that group's experience. And I did research and spent time with 3 very different groups. First of all, I started with astrophysicists. So I was looking at what they were doing in their laboratories. Then I worked with a bunch of queer football fans in Croatia, kind of queer friendly. So they were like anti-fascist and so on. And then after that, I worked with language activists in Serbia again. So lots of different diverse experiences. And that whole experience got me interested in editing as well. And I think especially the language activist stuff, because I learned all about things like standard language, which as copy editors, we have to handle every day in our copy editing work when you have to look at the entries in the Merriam-Webster dictionary or whatever.
Right, right. So that's how, so basically getting involved in that way, that's how it kind of evolved into your interest on the publishing side, the editing side. Is that right?
Yeah. When I published my anthropology books, I was just really curious and interested in the editorial aspects to it. I got a conversation going with my copy editor. I was like astounded by the tips and feedback I got from the proofreader. They really noticed incredibly precise things. And I just wanted to learn more about that as well. And I was also looking for an exit route from academia, because the higher up you get in the system, my sense was the more management and other non-research things you have to do. And I just wasn't interested in that. I was all about the writing. So.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you were exposed to the power of editors, and you were just, it's a magical world, right? And you were just amazed, and you're like, I want to be an editor too. Isn't the first, it's not the first time I've heard that. A lot of people who have exposure to the editorial side. I just met with someone yesterday who was a financial planner, and she's still in that space, but it was that she noticed that she gravitated more to the editorial and writing side of things. And I think it's a very powerful moment as a professional, when you're like, whoa, I can see a future in this area. And so that's what you did. You saw a future path for yourself, and you carved out an area in fiction specifically. Because I think it sounds like, you do both. I know you edit both. But you really do enjoy the world building aspect within fiction. So let's dive into that, and how you apply those on the developmental editing side. So that there are different levels of editing, obviously, and we don't need to explain what those are. But there is still a lot of conflicting ideas on what developmental editing is, and some editors say, well, it's the querying authors, it's the feedback back and forth, but not so much the actual moving of content or rewording or restructuring. My definition of developmental editing is that it is actually making those decisions, and that the author is trusting me to do that. And I've worked with, I want to say quote on air quotes here for author, but there were subject matter experts who were working full time in the industry that they were in. And so they were depending on me as a developmental editor to take what they sent and just make it better, make it clear, concise. And so that to me is developmental editing, is making those editorial decisions and then having the back and forth with the new drafts. So do you agree with that? So what is your definition, I should clarify, of dev editing?
Yeah. So as you were speaking, I was thinking, was that all nonfiction that you were talking about?
Yes. Yes. In my experience in as a full-time employee back in the day, it was, all nonfiction, educational material.
Okay, yeah. So for nonfiction editing, and I've done a lot of cultural anthropology, developmental editing, I'd say my definition matches yours. So there'll always be an initial critique phase where I'll read the manuscript, usually twice, and mark it up with a bunch of comments and write an editorial report. But for nonfiction, sometimes the authors will then say, can you do the next bit, like moving bits of text around and coming up with new titles, putting transition sentences and pieces like that in. I don't do that with fiction.
Right.
I separate those things out. I separate out a line editing phase from the developmental phase. And I think that's partly because that's how I like to work. And also, for everybody, like, a book is their baby, but especially for fiction authors, I think sometimes they're like, you're working with parts of their like unconscious and stuff like that quite often,
Right.
all of these tropes and things, and people can get super attached to them. So I'm more hands off about actually going in and making changes with fiction, for sure.
And that makes absolute sense because that is it's a creative, it's an art form, you know, it's more of a creative sense and not so much of, you know, standardizing material, foundational content and organizing and restructuring. So now let's make the official shift into fiction. So let's enter a new world. You've met an author who is, let's say they're right. Do you work in sci-fi? Do you work with sci-fi work at all? Or
So I cover spec fic. I gravitate towards fantasy most of all, but I love a good sci-fi novel if it's not too complex, like not too many different things going on.
Yeah, like a simple storyline where, you know, maybe there's 2 planets instead of like 50 galaxies or something.
Yeah,
but,
exactly.
But yeah, so let's talk specifically about, you know, those areas and elements that require a new world that is being created by the author. What are the things that you look for from your perspective? And it's so amazing with your background, how you can identify what's important to a specific culture or a specific community, motivating factors. I mean, things that would stick out to you, I think, more so than an editor without the background, without the anthropological background. So let's just dive in and talk about things that are things that you flag, things that you quickly can identify. I think it'll be helpful for listeners who don't have that background, and maybe you can give them that little bit of that edge when they look at things.
Okay, yeah. So I'll start by saying a few things about anthropology and how that is useful for world building. And lots of other backgrounds and even academic disciplines are useful for other kinds of world building, like a background in biology could be incredibly helpful for writing another kind of novel.
Exactly.
So, but what my anthropology background basically gives me is a deep knowledge and understanding of setting and context. And these are elements that are often pushed to one side, not so much by spec fic authors, but often by authors writing in other genres. So it's this excitement. Not many people get that excited about setting and world building, but I find it really interesting. So like, I'm here for that.
Yeah.
Another thing that anthropology gives me is a bottom-up perspective, and I'll say what I mean by that in a few words. So world building can be top-down. You could write a description of a planet on a piece of paper. You could say the climate is such and such. There are 5 societies and they have these qualities and so on. That would be top-down in approach. It'd be a bit like writing a list or something like that. But on the other hand, you got bottom-up world building, where you learn about the world through experiential encounters in the moment. And that's how anthropologists learn, because anthropologists don't sit in a room and write notes about a society. They take their body there and they physically experience that society. So this kind of bottom-up approach, which is the key to anthropology, it's also really helpful for revising scenes and thinking about, you know, world building and spec fic environments in a different way. And I think there's one example that I often mention, and that is from the Snowpiercer series on Netflix. So you could write down a description of the train in Snowpiercer, what's happening in all the different carriages, the different social divisions and hierarchies. That would be top down. And then there's this one scene where a character has a bath. And in the Snowpiercer world, having a bath isn't like you or me having a bath. It's incredibly difficult thing to do because it involves heating water in this frozen world. And it's just something that's really a luxury for a few people in the upper class. So by describing a scene from that perspective of what it feels like to have a bath and, conversations with the characters in that scene, that gives you this completely different bottom-up perspective where you experience the world through the characters' eyes and bodies themselves. So that's what I get excited about from anthropology. Now, when I'm looking at world building, there's about 6 different aspects I'll look for when I'm revising or reviewing a novel for world building. So I'll look at things like novelty. Is the world creative? I will look at completeness. Does it feel complete? Like Middle Earth, Tolkien, etc. That feels super complete.
Right.
But there are other fictional worlds that feel kind of half-baked, and that can be okay as well. It's just about getting the balance that's right for the story. Next up, there's consistency. Is the world consistent? So, and some of that can be about genre, like having an SF novel with a dragon might jerk readers out of the story, for example. It depends. Like right now, genre blending is becoming more and more popular in the market, but there are certain combinations that would just, jar the reader. Then you've got, is the story compelling? And compelling stories often deal in established tropes. So you need a balance between the new and kind of the familiar cornerstones. Is the world consciously developed? So has thought and care gone into the descriptions of the different cultures, the different societies, and the people in those worlds? And then the last aspect of world building that I look for, and this really applies to hard science fiction only, is the world building credible? If you've got descriptions of, I don't know, scientific processes or atmospheric conditions and things like that, are those credible, or would they pull the reader out of the story by seeming ridiculous? So
Okay.
that's what I look out for. Yeah.
That is so like well-rounded. That is a perfect answer. And I love that. I think a lot of listeners are going to come back and probably rewind and listen and take notes, because I think that is such a great aspect to consider when it comes to this. And when it comes to, especially book coaches who want to provide that valuable feedback for the authors, I mean, that's what they should look for. And that's what adds richness to the story. Like you said, yes, some can be half-baked and that's fine, but wouldn't you want it to be a rich deep dive into a new world that really is a true escape? I mean, that just adds to the art form of writing. And so having that book coach and that back and forth is just, it's the best. So now what happens when you have a author, and I'm sure it's happened in the past, where they may get into falling into typical stereotypes, whether it's a class in society or culture. How do you handle those situations where an author tends to stereotype something, someone, something? There's a lot of stereotypes out there. How do you handle that?
Sure. And I think that with stereotypes, that's often a consequence of leaning into compelling world building too much, relying too much on tropes that are already out there and tropes that have become too well worn. So when I'm advising authors on things like this, the first thing to point out is that there is no easy answer to this question. It depends really on the author's skill and empathy on one level, but also, and this is borrowed from the academic world, their positionality. And by positionality, I mean their relationship in relation to other human beings, and the power relations between them as well. So that could be their identities. I'm a queer non-binary person. That's part of my positionality. I grew up in a lower middle class household in Northern England. That's all part of my positionality and so on. And I think, and this is because I've trained in the social sciences, I think this is really important to consider in your writing, especially if you're from a more powerful culture or group and you're writing about a less powerful culture or group. And I think here that you need to make sure that the representations won't cause harm to members of those groups. And that is not an easy problem to understand or gauge. There are things you can do to help with this. So first of all, do not be an island. Do not write just by yourself. Get feedback, and especially get feedback from sensitivity readers and members of any communities that you're writing about, if they're real world communities. One thing I've noticed is that if you have point of view characters, if you tell the story from the perspective of people from these groups that you don't belong to, it's much more likely that you will cause harm there, because the level of knowledge required is so much more intimate. If you're having a POV character, you need to understand how they navigate like society and the social world. And if you've not had those same experiences, then you wouldn't know that. And here's a really simple example. There's a discussion in LGBTQ fiction called the shoulder checking problem. And as you might know, there are lots of romances written by cishet women, and a lot of them, had scenes where the characters would meet in a public place, but they'd just be comfortable and relaxed. They wouldn't think to check over their shoulder, for instance, before they kissed. And that's an example. That's something that a lot of LGBTQ people would think about. They'd be thinking, is it safe, completely safe in this environment for us to kiss or not? So that's like a really concrete example of where you can easily, like unintentionally as well, cause harm or write a story that just won't vibe with a lot of people. And one final tip, especially for spec fic, like fantasy fiction, science fiction, and so on, is not to base any of your fictional cultures on a single real world culture. Of course, if you're writing historical fiction or contemporary fiction, that's going to happen and you need to do your research. But with spec fic, what I recommend is combining lots of elements of different cultures creatively in a non-appropriative way, but in a creative way that works for your story. So,
okay, that is so, again, just so well thought out. So great for our listeners to hear the breakdown on how you would address things like that, and also how to identify those as well, because sometimes editors at the developmental stage, it's an overwhelming it can be overwhelming for us as editors. And so to have you break it down in that way, they'll be able to identify and maybe have a heightened sense when they're going through the story to say, maybe I'll flag this, or maybe I can discuss this with the author if something feels inauthentic, or if it feels like maybe just a little too, I don't want to say unrealistic, but maybe something that doesn't quite vibe with the reality of the situation, So now I know we're getting short on our time here. So let's shift over to tools and resources and things that you use to help you as an editor, specifically with world building. But first, do you have a webinar? Are you hosting a webinar on world building?
Yes, I do.
Okay, let's talk about that.
Sure. So I have a webinar. It's called Developmental Editing for World Building. It has a practical focus. I outline the elements of good world building, which I've just mentioned here. And then the bit which I haven't, I dive into 7 common world building problems that crop up frequently in spec fic stories.
Oh, perfect.
And then I offer solutions. So it's quite simple, really.
Okay. Yeah. That is so perfect, though. I mean, that's exactly what an editor would need to hear. And then there's so many, that's that's like a perfect takeaway too, to take a webinar, have everything listed there, and then it becomes like a guide when editors work in the book coaching capacity.
Mm,
They'll have everything that they need. So that is a wonderful
yeah.
tool, wonderful resource. I'll definitely put that in the show notes as well, so our listeners can go there. And if we haven't already said that your company is called The Narrative Craft,
That's
and
right.
we'll absolutely put a link to your website. But let's talk more about tools. Let's get back into, we have some time left, right?
Yeah.
So, what are some other specific tools or frameworks that you would recommend aside from your wonderful webinar, that our listeners could look into? Are any books that you've read? Any other public figures or anybody that would be a good resource um, for listeners who are working in this world right now?
Okay. Well, first of all, for editors who are just starting out, I highly recommend Sophie Playall's courses on fiction developmental editing. I've not taken those courses myself, but I've taken some of her webinars and they were fantastic. And I've only
Excellent.
heard good things about her courses. Next up, I highly recommend Jennifer Lawler's courses. So I worked my way through the developmental editing for fiction certificate with her. These were amazing and especially good, I felt, for starting to understand the market and especially the US market. So you can take courses in things like upmarket fiction, and how that's different from literary fiction and what the deal is with contemporary fiction. Does it even exist anymore? And all of these sorts of questions. So I feel like I got a lot of industry knowledge as alongside the kind of the nuts and bolts of developmental editing through her courses. And then there are a bunch of books that I recommend and love as well. So one, I'm a firm believer in checklists, and Beth Hill has this great checklist for developmental editing at the back of her Magic of Fiction book. So that's one resource I recommend. Janice Hardy's books on how to edit and revise your novel are also really, really good. And my personal favorite is The Wonder Book. I don't know if you know The Wonder Book.
No.
Okay, it's basically a developmental editing / write fiction craft book in graphic novel form, and it just has loads of beautiful illustrations.
Oh, that sounds
It
cool.
I love it. I highly recommend it.
Okay. I'll add that to
And
my list.
and one final resource which I found incredibly helpful is for SpecFic is Mythcreants. So they have a website. They have a Discord. They have loads of content, a blog. They even have courses. They're really good and they're so into tension, like understanding how tension works in stories. I think that is one of their niches beyond the SpecFic specialism. They have they have like theorized how tension works in stories, and it's just really helpful and cool. So
Oh my gosh, what a perfect list. I mean, I'm again putting all of that in the show notes as well. Wonderful list of resources for editors who are already doing this type of thing, are already book coaching, they're already doing dev editing. It's always great to sharpen our skills. And even editors who want to get into this, that would be me. I'm an editor who someday would love to dive into fiction and work with fiction authors. But hearing your guidance and your perspective, it makes it feel within reach. And I think
yeah.
that's part of it too, is that editors tend to feel, oh, well, I didn't take the class, or I didn't do this, and
Mm.
I didn't study anthropology. It's like, but
Mm-hmm.
you can still edit this material. And I
Yeah.
think that hearing you talk and hearing you explain things, yes, it has given you an edge, which is so awesome. But I think all editors can do this. And like I said, it does feel within reach for anybody, especially with foundational editorial skills. So I would like to continue this conversation, and we will continue this conversation in our special exclusive content, which we will continue to record. So
Mm-hmm.
listeners, if you're interested in listening to exclusive content, Andy and I are going to get in a little bit into maybe AI, where what we think AI, where we're at with that, maybe some future predictions, outlook for the future in fiction for fiction writers, and then we'll get into some other personal stories. I want to hear about what inspires Andy and what he does. So if you're interested, look at my Patreon, join my Patreon to get access to our exclusive content. But this is wrapping it up. Thank you so much, Andrew, for this wonderful interview. And we will continue discussing AI and all the things that I mentioned.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Editor's Half Hour. This podcast is your go-to resource for editorial trends, opening the discussion for new ideas through the real-life stories of editors. For more information about Nadia Jaja Pupa and her business, visit peakpublishing.com. That's PIQUE publishing.com. And remember to subscribe and follow the Editor's Half Hour wherever you get your podcasts.